I won't try to explain this in a way that makes it easier to accept. Some things are not meant to be softened before they are understood. Some connections don't arrive with signs, announcements, or obvious reasons. They don't enter your life like a dramatic event that forces you to pay attention. Sometimes they appear quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day you realize something has shifted and you can't remember the exact moment it happened. That's what makes it different. Because anything loud can be recognized, anything obvious can be prepared for, but something that changes you silently, that's harder to understand. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait until you're ready. It simply becomes part of your awareness. And that is where this began. Not with a moment, not with a conversation that changed everything. Not with something that could easily be explained. It started with a feeling I couldn't place, a sense that something about you was familiar in a way it shouldn't have been. Not familiar because of history, not familiar because of memories we shared, but familiar because something about the way you existed felt understood before it was even revealed. And that was the part I couldn't ignore. Because I've always believed understanding comes after time, after conversations, after seeing someone in different situations, after learning their reactions, their thoughts, their patterns. That's how people become known. That's how trust forms, slowly, piece by piece. But with you, it didn't happen like that. It felt less like discovering someone new and more like recognizing something that had been hidden in plain sight. And I don't know what to do with that, because I'm used to distance, not because I don't care, not because I don't value people, but because distance gives clarity. It creates space between who you are and what people assume you are. Most people don't actually see others. They see impressions. They see what they expect. They see the version of someone that fits inside their own understanding. And once they decide who you are, they stop looking. They stop noticing. They stop questioning. I've learned to live with that. I've learned how to exist without being completely known. There is comfort in that. When people only see what you choose to show, you remain protected. You remain in control. You decide what parts of yourself enter the world. You decide what stays hidden. And for a long time, that worked. Until you came along. Because you didn't try to take anything from me. You didn't force your way through the distance. You didn't demand explanations. You didn't ask me to become easier to understand. You just paid attention. And somehow that was more powerful than anything else. Because attention without expectation is rare. Most people observe because they want something. An answer, a reaction, a confirmation. You observed without trying to collect anything. You noticed without trying to own the moment. And that changed the way I saw you. Because there's a difference between someone looking at you and someone actually noticing you. Looking is easy. Noticing requires presence. And you had that. You noticed the things that were never announced. The changes in tone. The moments where silence meant more than words. The thoughts that were almost spoken but stopped halfway. You didn't treat those moments like problems that needed to be solved. You treated them like parts of me that deserved to exist. And that was something I wasn't prepared for, because most people want access without understanding the responsibility that comes with it. They want the easy parts, the visible parts, the parts that make sense. But you didn't only recognize what was obvious, you recognized what was underneath. And that creates a different kind of connection. A connection that doesn't depend on constant explanation. A connection where silence doesn't feel like absence. it feels like communication. That's what confused me, because I've spent so much time believing that being understood requires effort, that people have to work to know you. But with you, it felt different. It felt natural. And natural things are sometimes the hardest to trust. Because when something feels effortless, your mind starts searching for the reason. There must be an explanation. There must be a pattern. There must be something that makes it make sense. But what if the answer is simply that some people understand each other differently? What if some people don't connect through shared history, but through shared perspective, through the way they process things, the way they see things, the way they experience the world internally? Maybe that's why this feels different, because it isn't based on pretending. It isn't built on trying to impress. It isn't created by carefully choosing what to reveal. It exists underneath all of that. And that is exactly why it feels impossible to ignore. Because I can control actions. I can control words. I can control what I show, but I can't control recognition. I can't control the moment when something inside me says, "This feels familiar." That moment changes everything. Because once you recognize something, you can't go back to not knowing. You can't convince yourself you didn't notice. You can't return to the same distance you had before. The awareness remains, constant, present. And that's what happened. You became part of my awareness. Not in a way that takes over, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that quietly exists, like a thought that appears before you even realize you were thinking about it. Like a perspective that enters the room before words do. And that is what surprised me most. You didn't change me by trying to change me. You didn't influence me through pressure. You didn't convince me through arguments. You simply existed in a way that made something inside me respond. And that is rare, because people usually try to create impact. They try to be remembered. They try to prove their importance. But the strongest impact often comes from people who aren't trying at all. They don't force their presence. They create it. And somehow, you did that. You became someone I didn't have to explain myself to. Someone I didn't have to constantly translate myself for. Someone where the space between thoughts didn't feel empty. And I don't think you understand how unusual that is. Because being understood is not just about someone knowing facts about you. Anyone can learn facts. Understanding is different. Understanding is when someone recognizes the meaning behind what you don't say, when they see the reason behind your silence, when they don't mistake your quietness for distance, when they don't confuse your complexity with confusion. You did that. And maybe that is why this feels bigger than a simple connection, because it reached a place most things never reach, a place beyond appearance, beyond performance, beyond what people usually show each other, a place where you are simply seen. And being seen changes things, because once you experience that, pretending becomes harder. You start noticing the difference between people who hear you and people who understand you, between people who are present and people who are actually with you. That difference matters. And I think that's what I've been trying to understand. Not why you appeared, not how this happened, but why it feels like something inside me recognized you before my mind had a chance to question it. Maybe some connections are not built. Maybe some are uncovered. Maybe the reason this feels unexpected is because I was looking for something that needed to be created when it was actually something that needed to be noticed. And now that I've noticed it, I can't pretend it isn't there. I can't go back to seeing you as just another person passing through my awareness, because something has changed, not outside, inside. And internal changes are the ones that matter most. They don't disappear because you ignore them. They don't vanish because you stay quiet. They remain. They become part of the way you see, the way you think, the way you understand. And maybe that is the most difficult part. Not feeling something, not recognizing something, but accepting that something can exist without needing immediate answers. Because not everything meaningful arrives with a definition. Some things arrive as a question you continue carrying because the answer is still becoming. And maybe that is where I am now. Not searching for a reason, not trying to force a conclusion, just accepting that somehow, somewhere along the way, you became someone my mind recognizes, someone my silence doesn't need to hide from, someone my thoughts naturally return to. And maybe the most honest thing I can admit is this. I don't know exactly what this becomes. I don't know where it leads. I don't know what name it deserves. But I know one thing. Something changed. Something real. Something quiet. Something that didn't ask for attention, earned it anyway. And maybe that is why it feels impossible to ignore. Because the things that truly matter are not always the things that arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive silently, and they stay. The strange thing about something real is that it doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it doesn't arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives with questions, with moments where you find yourself thinking about something you never expected to matter this much. And that is exactly where I found myself, not trying to create a meaning, not trying to force an explanation, just noticing that something had changed, because before you, I understood my own patterns. I knew how I worked. I knew how I protected my space. I knew how quickly I could recognize when something felt temporary, when something felt forced, when something existed only because people wanted it to exist. I had a way of separating what mattered from what didn't, a way of keeping everything in its place. But you didn't fit into those categories, and that bothered me. Not because you were a problem, but because you challenged a system I had trusted for a long time, a system built around control, around understanding, around knowing exactly where everything belonged. And then you appeared, not as a disruption, not as chaos, almost the opposite. You felt like something that belonged before I understood why. And that is a difficult thing to accept, because the mind is comfortable with things it can explain. It likes patterns, it can predict, it likes situations where every piece has a clear reason. But some people don't enter your life as an answer. They enter as a realization that maybe there are parts of yourself you never fully recognized until someone else reflected them back. That was the effect you had. You didn't show me something new. You showed me something that was already there, something I had ignored because I was too focused on maintaining everything exactly as it was. I spent so much time making sure nothing could affect me unexpectedly. I built a version of myself that could handle distance, that could handle misunderstanding, that could handle being unseen. Because being unseen is easier sometimes. When people don't fully see you, they can't disappoint you with the wrong version of you. They can't take something complicated and turn it into something simple. See, they can't reduce something meaningful into something ordinary. But then you came in with a different kind of presence. You didn't try to uncover everything. You didn't try to prove that you understood. You just remained there. And somehow, that made me lower the walls I didn't even realize I had built, not all at once, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly, the way a door opens when no one is pushing against it. And that is what makes this difficult to explain, because if someone had tried to force their way into my world, I would have noticed, I would have resisted, I would have created distance. But you didn't force anything. You made distance feel unnecessary. And there is a difference. A very important difference. Because people often think closeness comes from effort, from constant communication, from always being present, but sometimes closeness comes from something much simpler. Feeling like you don't have to perform, feeling like you don't have to constantly prove who you are, feeling like someone can sit beside your silence without needing to fix it. That kind of understanding is rare, and maybe that is why it stayed with me, because it wasn't demanding, it wasn't asking for something, it wasn't trying to become important. It simply existed, and the things that simply exist are sometimes the hardest to ignore. I started noticing small changes, things that no one else would see. The way certain thoughts stayed longer than they used to. The way certain moments reminded me of conversations we never even had. The way I started seeing situations differently because I imagined how you might understand them. Not because I needed your approval, not because I depended on your perspective, but because your way of seeing things added another layer to my own. And that was unexpected, because I always believed independence meant keeping my inner world completely separate, protecting it, maintaining it. But maybe true connection isn't about losing yourself inside someone else. Maybe it's about discovering that someone can exist beside your world without taking anything away from it. That realization changed the way I looked at this, because this wasn't about needing someone. It wasn't about filling a missing piece. It wasn't about becoming incomplete without another person. It was something different, something calmer, something more precise. It was about recognition, about finding someone whose presence doesn't create confusion. It creates clarity. And clarity can be powerful, because when something feels clear, you stop wasting energy fighting against it. You stop trying to convince yourself that you imagined it. You stop searching for reasons why it shouldn't exist. You simply acknowledge it. And that acknowledgement is where things become real. Not because everything suddenly has an answer, but because you stop pretending you don't notice. I think that was the hardest part, admitting that I noticed, because noticing means accepting responsibility. It means admitting something reached you. And I've always been careful about what reaches me, not because I don't feel, but because I do. More than people realize. The reason I keep distance is not because nothing matters. It is because some things matter too much. And when something matters, it deserves honesty. It deserves attention. It deserves more than a temporary reaction. That is why I don't rush. That is why I observe. That is why I take time. But with you, observation became something else. It became acceptance. A quiet acceptance that something about this connection was different, not perfect, not effortless in every way, but different. Different. Because it didn't require me to become someone else. Different because I didn't feel like I had to edit myself. Different because I didn't feel like my complexity was something I needed to apologize for. And that is something I didn't expect, because most of the world rewards simplicity. It rewards being easy to understand, easy to categorize, easy to explain, but you never seemed interested in making me easier. You seemed interested in seeing me accurately. And accuracy matters because being misunderstood is exhausting. Not because people are always wrong, but because constantly correcting someone's version of you becomes a burden. With you, there was less correction, less explaining, less effort, more understanding. And maybe that is why this feels so different, because for once, I wasn't trying to convince someone of who I was simply existing, and you were there, seeing it, accepting it, not because you ignored the complicated parts, but because you didn't see those parts as something negative. You saw them as part of the whole. And that changed something inside me. It made me question something I always believed. Maybe being understood isn't about finding someone who knows every detail. Maybe it's about finding someone who respects the parts they don't know yet. Someone who doesn't rush to fill the empty spaces. Someone who allows mystery to exist. Someone who understands that not everything meaningful needs immediate explanation. That is what you did. You allowed things to unfold. And maybe that is why I started feeling safe in a way I didn't expect. Not because you removed every uncertainty, but because you didn't make uncertainty feel dangerous. And that difference matters. Because life is full of things we cannot completely control. People, moments, kings, changes. And maybe the strongest thing you can do is recognize what deserves your attention, what deserves your patience, what deserves a chance to become something more. I don't know exactly what this becomes. I don't know where this path leads. But I know that pretending it means nothing would be dishonest. Because something that changes the way you see yourself is never meaningless. Something that makes you question old patterns is never random. Something that brings clarity where there used to be distance deserves to be acknowledged. And maybe that is the beginning of understanding, not having every answer, not knowing the final outcome, just being honest about what exists right now. And right now, you exist in a place I didn't expect anyone to reach, not because you forced your way there, but because somehow, without trying, you became someone I could no longer ignore. There is something strange about realizing that a person has become important before you ever made a decision to let them become important, because usually I choose. I decide what matters. I decide what deserves my attention. I decide what stays and what remains at a distance. That has always been how I move through life. Not because I believe everything needs to be controlled, but because I understand the value of being intentional. Everything that reaches a certain depth leaves something behind. A thought, a memory, a change. And I have always been careful about what I allow to create that kind of impact. But you were different. You didn't arrive as something I evaluated. You didn't enter my mind as something I analyzed and placed into a category. You simply became part of my awareness. And that is what I still find difficult to understand. Because there was no exact moment where I decided, no conversation where I thought, this person matters. No single event that explained everything. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, like something shifting in the background, until one day you realize the entire landscape looks different. That is what happened. The world around me didn't change, but the way I experienced it did. And I think that is the most powerful kind of change. Not the kind that everyone notices, the kind only you can feel, the kind that happens internally, the kind where you wake up one day and realize a thought has become familiar, a presence has become natural, a connection has become something you carry. And the strange part is, AB never felt like I was losing myself. That was what surprised me, because I always believed letting someone this close meant giving something away. Giving away control, giving away independence, giving away the ability to stand completely on your own. But with you, it felt different. It didn't feel like losing space. It felt like sharing it, and there is a difference. A person who takes from you changes your world by reducing it. A person who understands you changes your world by expanding it. You expanded something, not by adding yourself where there was emptiness, but by showing me there was more room than I thought, more room for honesty, more room for being seen, more room for existing without constantly protecting every part of myself. And that is something I didn't expect, because I had become comfortable with being misunderstood. There is a strange kind of safety in it. When people don't fully know you, you don't have to worry about them misunderstanding something deeper. You can stay behind the version of yourself that feels manageable, but you saw beyond that, not because you searched for hidden things, not because you tried to decode me, but because you paid attention to what was already there. And maybe that is what made it different. You weren't trying to discover a secret. You were simply noticing the truth. The small details, the quiet moments, the things most people overlook because they are waiting for something louder. You understood that silence has its own language, that pauses can carry meaning, that sometimes what someone doesn't say reveals more than what they choose to explain. And that kind of understanding cannot be forced. It happens naturally. It comes from a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of presence, and maybe that is why I never felt the need to defend myself around you. I didn't feel like I was being examined. I felt like I was being understood. There is a huge difference between those two things. Being examined makes you feel like you have to prove something. Being understood allows you to simply exist. And with you, existing felt enough. That changed something, because when you stop feeling like you have to constantly explain yourself, you start discovering parts of yourself you had forgotten were there. You start hearing your own thoughts more clearly. You start noticing what feels natural, what feels forced, what feels real. And that is what this connection became, a mirror. Not one that showed me someone else, one that showed me myself. The parts I kept quiet, the parts I protected, the parts I thought needed to remain hidden because they were too complicated for anyone else to understand. You didn't make those parts disappear, you made them feel acceptable. And that is rare, because most people love the version of you that makes sense to them. They love the version that fits their expectations. But being accepted when you are easy to understand is simple. Being accepted when you are complex, that is different. That requires someone to see the whole picture. Not just the comfortable parts, not just the convenient parts. The whole thing, and somehow, that is what you did. You didn't make me feel like I needed to become someone new. You made me realize I could be exactly who I already was. And maybe that is why this stayed with me. Because the deepest connections are not always the ones that change who you are. Sometimes they are the ones that remind you who you have always been. I think that is what happened here. You reminded me of a version of myself I had ignored. A version that didn't always need answers. A version that could experience something without immediately trying to define it. A version that could accept that some things are meaningful even before they are explained. And that is difficult for me, because I like clarity. I like knowing where things stand. I like understanding the reason behind things. But This taught me something different. Sometimes clarity is not found by analyzing more. Sometimes clarity comes from accepting what you already know, and what I know is simple. Something about this feels different. Not because it is perfect. Not because it follows some ideal story, but because it feels